I'm going to talk a bit about High Street 2012, which I think follows on well from the couple of presentations we've seen, because it takes that analysis of how complex high streets are and looks at how we might nurture change there. So my presentation is going to be about how you actually do things on those streets, how you can work there to improve the quality of the streetscape and to help nurture that vitality. Because I think I suppose the one thing I would add to the presentations that we've had is that not only is it complex in terms of analysing what's there, but it's doubly complex because that's constantly evolving. So we're engaging not only in something that's complex in itself, but very complex in the way that it's changing. Just quickly a bit about me. My name's Paul Harper. I work for Design for London at the GLA. I've been there for about 6 or 7 years now, largely focusing on public space projects, on the previous mayor's 100 Public Spaces projects, on the current mayor's Great Spaces projects, on Great Outdoors. I've been involved in the High Street research that Matthew mentioned earlier as well, and for the last 4 years on High Street 2012. What I'm going to do is go through a little bit of history about the project, explain a bit about what the vision was, and then just run along the length of the street and go through some of the projects that have happened and are still happening. And what I hope to do, and I hope I don't forget to do, is make sure that as I'm going through, I also give credit to the design teams that have been working on the different projects. Perhaps they should really be the people standing here and presenting these projects. But that's been at the core of getting some high quality change along the street, is getting the right mix of designers working on the projects. What is High Street 2012? It's a project to look at largely at public realm improvements along the stretch of street that runs from Aldgate in the city to the Olympic Park. And I guess the important words to pick out of this description are that it is an everyday space, but it's also a remarkable one. It's an historic corridor, but it's also a modern one, and it's an evolving corridor. This is a plan showing the mix of uses. You can't read it at all, but the different colours should give you some idea of the mix of uses that are there. And as I said, the idea of the conceit, if you like, behind the project was that it connected the city to the Olympic Park. The project started with Tower Hamlets coming up with the idea of an Olympic Boulevard. And the thinking behind that was, although Tower Hamlets were one of the host boroughs, they didn't have an Olympic site in their borough. And they were thinking, well, how can we get something out of this? So they came to us and said, well, we would like to invent this street as our Olympic site, and came up with the idea of an Olympic Boulevard. At the same time, Transport for London were then looking at how they approached investment in their streets. And we're talking about something called network management plans, which looked across the different modes of transport on the streets, and were a step forward in the way that they, from where they previously were, which had focused on individual modes, buses or cars moving along the street. So we got together with TfL and with Tower Hamlets, with Newham as well, because they the borough that the street is in from Bow to the Olympic Park, with London Thames Gateway Development Corporation, because they were assisting in the development of the land around the Olympics and in the Thames Gateway corridor, and with English Heritage, because they were interested in the history of the street. So the discussions that we had around the Olympic Boulevard started to bring together some of the stakeholders involved along the street. We then jointly commissioned fluid architects working with Tribal, who did the economic analysis behind the project, and looked at did a study along the street. And what the results of that study were a vision document that set out. Well, it was a vision document that first did some analysis along the street. So there was an historic analysis, there was an analysis of what was there in terms of master plans, planning frameworks and so on, looked at the physical and social context, and came up with a range of area studies that looked at how you might nurture change in these different areas along the street. And that was backed up by some quite detailed research on the way that the street functioned at the moment and the kind of things that we might be able to influence through investing in the fabric of along the street. The work that Fluid did came up with a way of organising our work, I suppose, more than anything else, that looked at the street in 3 sections. I mean, it's a 4-mile stretch of street, so it's quite long. The character does change as you move along. But we found this to be a convincing way of at least characterising the way we worked across, in 3 sections. The first section from Whitechapel to Mile End, an historic mixed-use street. From Mile End to Bow, a more residential high street. And then from Bow to Stratford, we characterised that as a 21st century high street. The Bow to Stratford end is where the greatest amount of change was taking place over the shortest period. But there is change taking place along all of those. Obviously at the Whitechapel to Mile End stretch, it's on the city fringe. There's the encroachment of the city into the poorer areas of Tower Hamlets. How do we deal with that? There's also the coming of Crossrail to Whitechapel, the Royal London Hospital being built there, one of the largest hospitals in Europe. And equally there's change happening from Mile End to Bow, but over a longer period. So that set the context for the kind of interventions that we then decided to take forward. This is a map that we produced that was done by the Studio Marskoff, the graphic designers. You won't believe how long it took us to get a map together that was able to capture a 4-mile length of street. But I think in the end we ended up with something that's been incredibly useful for us in explaining what the project was about. And the way that we approached taking the project forward was to look at some street actions that we'd carry forward along the whole of the street. So some things that were continuous along the street that we wanted to try and reinforce. And those were things like looking at the historic fabric all along the street, looking at the green infrastructure, looking at community projects along the street, looking at lighting, looking at cycleways, and looking at wayfinding. We felt those things we could provide some consistency all along the street from the city to the Olympic Park. But weaved in with that, we looked at 8 different character areas where we'd look at change specific to those areas that would build on the existing character, take account of the change that was happening now, and build in flexibility for change that we would predict would happen and will happen in the future. Sitting alongside that, there was where we were coming from in looking at this project. We were then based in the London Development Agency, so there was a regeneration imperative behind whether the public sector would invest in the project, and community engagement was part of that, needed to be part of that discussion. So there was also a street action that looked at community projects, and these are some of the ideas that there were in the early part of the project. I probably won't return to this much as a thread in itself, so just to say that what this eventually turned into was 19 different community projects along the street that were funded, in fact, through English Heritage grants that were largely focused around trying to bring alive the history of the street through engagement with existing communities that are living along there. Once the vision study was done, we continued with the steering group of the stakeholders that I already described, but quite a bit of our activity was focused on Tower Hamlets and taking forward a range of projects there. These design principles were put together by MUF, who were one of the design practices that were procured. And I think that I won't go through them all, but the aim, the overarching principle, I suppose, behind these design principles was the idea that we would tread lightly on what was there. We wanted to try and build on the character of the existing spaces and to provide an environment that was more inclusive than the space that was there at the time. So that's a bit of the history. What I'll do now is go through some of the projects that happened along the street and the challenges that we faced and the complexity of it, and hopefully provide some examples of what we think are good changes that have happened.